When the long winter finally loosened its grip, the city stirred as though waking from a dream it had carried too long. A thin, trembling silence clung to every surface, holding the world in a delicate pause. And in that quiet stillness, something subtle but certain shifted, an early whisper that life was ready to return. The city, slowly stretching back into itself, remained wrapped in a fragile hush. Streets held the final traces of frost, roofs shimmered with the faint memory of snow, and the river, the ancient pulse of the place, moved with a calm patience, as if it remembered every season more clearly than the people beside it. In that soft moment between winter and renewal, the simplest things seemed newly precious. A wisp of mist lifting from the water, a glance through a frosted pane, the slow turn of a wheel over thinning snow. Each detail felt enough to loosen something quiet and tender inside the heart. After the long storm, the city resembled a soul emerging from shadow, worn perhaps, but shimmering with gentle resilience. As lamps flickered to life at dusk, their warm glow spread like a quiet promise, reminding everyone that life always finds its way back. Fishermen along the riverbanks, children chasing small streams between cobblestones, shopkeepers unlocking doors long sealed by the cold, these familiar motions became the slow, steady breaths of a city learning to move again. And when the sun slipped behind the bridges, leaving trembling ribbons of gold across the water, it became clear that this place did not live only in crowds or motion. It lived in memory held softly by those who kept believing in tomorrow. It lived in unspoken gestures, in the courage of ordinary hands, in the sound of laughter returning after too many silent days. In the amber light of late afternoon, the city revealed its gentlest face, not grand, not loud, but deeply human. This is a story of returning to warmth, to rhythm, to the modest beauty of daily life that once felt impossibly distant beneath winter's weight. It is a story without triumph or spectacle, only the quiet persistence of light entering darkened rooms again, the river carrying reflections like small secrets, and people gathering the scattered pieces of life with patience. Often, the most moving beauty lies not in what is extraordinary, but in the way life rises from stillness softly, steadily, humbly. A mild winter. The year was 1888. Along the eastern coast of the United States, the air had stayed soft through months that were usually harsh. The season felt hesitant, as if winter itself had grown tired. Days moved gently from one to another. In New York City, the streets remained clear, and the sound of wheels on cobblestone carried farther than it normally did. Snow had visited only once or twice and had melted within hours. Trees had begun to open their buds far too early, and birds had returned from the south before their time. The mornings were cool but forgiving. The afternoons held a light that seemed borrowed from spring. People moved about the city without the usual layers of wool and fur. Children walked to school in thinner coats. Vendors opened their stalls earlier, calling out beneath the pale sun. Men stood by street corners reading the day's paper, with gloved hands folded behind their backs. Women leaned out of windows to let the mild air move through their rooms. It was said to be the gentlest winter in nearly 20 years. For many, it was a comfort. For others, it was a curiosity, a season that had forgotten what it was meant to be. Across the river in New Jersey lived a poet, 68 years old, named Walt Whitman. He watched the early buds appear outside his window. He saw a single dandelion bloom in a patch of sheltered grass near his home. The sight pleased him. He sat by his small wooden desk and began to write. The poem he composed was short and light in spirit. He titled it, "The First Dandelion." In it he wrote of the golden flower as the first sign of spring, pure and calm, untouched by the noise of the world. When he finished, he folded the page carefully and mailed it to the New York Herald. It was accepted for publication and scheduled to appear 2 days later. Whitman returned to his window and watched the mild evening settle over the river. The sky turned a soft silver. He believed the worst of winter had passed. In New York, the city followed its rhythm. Streetcars clattered along their tracks. Theaters glowed with warm gaslight. Opera houses filled with conversation before each performance. People moved easily through the streets, freed from heavy snow and biting wind. Saturday, March 10th, arrived with bright skies and a temperature near 50 degrees. It felt entirely like April. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and the smoke of distant chimneys. On stoops and sidewalks, neighbors greeted one another with remarks about the pleasant change. "Mother Nature has given us an early spring," one man said to another. His words drifted away with a soft breeze that carried no hint of danger. The poet's small yellow flower was not the only thing to open that weekend. All across the city, windows opened as well. Curtains fluttered. Dust rose from floors that had been sealed through months of cold. People moved through markets and parks with a sense of relief. The sound of carriage wheels mixed with the laughter of children. At the harbor, ships waited at anchor beneath a calm sky. Sailors leaned on railings and spoke of the unseasonable warmth. Even the horses, free from the weight of slush and ice, stepped lightly along the avenues. The city breathed in, unaware that it was the deep breath before a long hold. In the offices of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, the instruments rested on their tables, ticking and humming softly. Barometers, thermometers, and wind gauges produced numbers that seemed ordinary. Reports arrived from nearby towns showing mild air and steady pressure. To the forecasters, nothing appeared alarming. The next day's prediction was written and sent. Fresh to brisk southerly winds with rain, followed by colder westerly winds and clearing weather. The message traveled through telegraph lines that stretched from city to city like thin, humming threads. No one suspected that within 48 hours, those same wires would hang silent, heavy with ice. Night fell quietly on March 10th. Theaters filled again. Restaurants buzzed with music and the clink of glasses. The famous piano maker William Steinway spent the evening with his family, attending a show before returning home. He remarked on the gentle air and the comfort of walking without a winter coat. His diary would soon carry a different tone, but for now he wrote only of mildness. Elsewhere, in small parlors and boarding houses, people prepared for bed, leaving their windows open a crack to let in the cool, pleasant breeze. Somewhere, a street lamp flickered and went out, unnoticed. The city slept in confidence. The following morning, Sunday, March 11th, dawned even warmer. The sky had changed, though few paid attention. The light was pale, the air thicker, a little heavier against the skin. Church bells rang through neighborhoods, summoning the faithful. But it was not a day for heavy coats or long walks through snow. Families stepped into the streets, dressed for spring. Children ran ahead, their voices carrying in the still air. Men tipped their hats to one another, and women smiled as they passed along the cobbled crossings. The city felt generous, as though it had given back the time lost to earlier winters. By midday, faint clouds gathered to the north, low and slow. The first change in the wind brushed against the harbor waters, unnoticed by those walking along the docks. In taverns, the talk turned to business, to planting, to the possibility of an early harvest in the countryside. In the downtown offices, brokers discussed the week ahead. Their conversations carried a tone of optimism. The season of opportunity had come early, they believed. Even in the narrow tenement streets, where laundry hung between windows, there was a lightness of mood. Mothers lifted their children to see the sun between the buildings. It was a rare kindness in a city that could be harsh. The wind shifted once more, now from the north, faint but cooler. The movement went mostly unnoticed, though a few old sailors paused at the docks and looked toward the horizon. They saw a thin line of gray beyond the river's mouth. By late afternoon, the air had begun to thicken. The temperature fell by a few degrees. Clouds pressed closer together, closing the distance between sky and ground. The first drops of rain appeared on the windows of carriages. Pedestrians lifted their collars and quickened their pace. A policeman at Central Park advised a lingering group to head home. "Looks like weather coming," he said quietly, his breath visible for the first time that week. Out at sea, ship captains watched the northern sky grow darker. Some delayed their departures. Others, bound by schedule, set sail despite the unease that came with shifting wind. The rain grew steadier, tapping gently on the city's roofs. Evening came early under the low clouds. The lamps along Broadway cast small halos of yellow through the mist. Rain continued, cold now, falling harder against the stone facades. Most people thought little of it. The forecast had promised rain, after all. Families gathered around their stoves, letting the warmth fill their small apartments. The sound of the rain was steady, rhythmic, and for many it was a comfort that lulled them toward sleep. In the weather office, though, numbers on the instruments began to change quickly. The barometer dropped. Temperatures fell faster than predicted. Telegraph operators sent hurried messages north and west, asking for updates. Replies came in slower, reporting falling pressure and heavier rain. Within hours, the lines themselves began to fail. Past midnight, the rain turned to sleet, The shift was subtle at first, a different sound against the window panes, sharper and lighter. Then the wind rose. It rushed between the buildings with a voice of its own, long and unbroken. The sleet became snow, driven sideways. The city, which had been resting, began to tremble beneath it. Loose shutters banged. Signs creaked on their hinges. The few who were still awake heard the change and closed their windows tight. The gaslights wavered in the wind, their flames stretching thin before settling again. The air grew colder by the minute. In the quiet before sleep, the sound of the storm deepened. Snow struck the glass like handfuls of sand. The streets emptied. A watchman, making his rounds, bent forward against the wind, his lantern swaying. He could see only a few feet ahead. The city disappeared behind a curtain of white. Each gust carried with it the beginning of something vast, though no one yet understood the scale of what was arriving. Through the night, the temperature continued to fall. Snow gathered on rooftops and steps, filling the corners of alleyways and covering the car tracks that only hours earlier had gleamed with rain. Inside the tenements, families pulled blankets tighter. Inside the grand homes, fires were stoked higher. Everywhere the sound of wind replaced the sound of rain. It hummed through the city like a long, low note that would not end. The poet in New Jersey lay awake for a while, listening. He could not see the flower that had inspired him. It was already hidden beneath snow. He closed his eyes. Outside, the world continued to change shape. By the small hours of morning, March 12th, New York was no longer the same city that had gone to bed beneath the sound of rain. Drifts formed along the avenues. Telegraph lines sagged under the weight of ice. The wind moved through the empty spaces with relentless force. It did not hurry. It simply continued, steady, filling every gap. The gentle winter had vanished, replaced by a silence made of snow and air. The city slept under its first deep cover of white, unaware of what the day would bring. The night the wind rose. The wind began before dawn. It came quietly at first, moving through the narrow streets like a low breath. The city lay half asleep beneath its blanket of snow, unaware of what was building above. The air had turned colder through the night, and the snow that had started as fine powder now fell in thick, slanting sheets. By the early hours of Monday, March 12th, the wind gathered strength, shaping the storm into something vast and deliberate. It pushed along the harbor and through the long canyons of the city. Snow drifted from roof to roof, piling into corners and doorways. Chimneys disappeared under white ridges. The outlines of familiar buildings softened until they looked like sketches fading from the page. In the pale gray of morning, it was difficult to tell where the ground ended and the air began. The entire world seemed made of snow and motion. Telegraph poles leaned under the weight of ice. The wires trembled, singing faintly as the wind passed over them. Then they snapped, one after another, the sound sharp and distant. Messages that had been moving between cities stopped midway. No new forecasts went out. The weather, once a matter of report and prediction, now belonged only to itself. On Broadway, the streetcars stood still. The iron tracks were hidden, the horses unfit to move through the rising drifts. Drivers sheltered in nearby doorways, stamping their feet, holding the reins in their hands, though there was nowhere to go. The snow rose to their knees. The air was filled with a soft hiss that never paused. Inside the tenements, windows frosted over from within, families gathered in single rooms around coal stoves. The warmth was thin but steady. Mothers wrapped scarves around their children, pressing them close. The smell of smoke mixed with the dry cold that seeped through walls. Each gust of wind shook the window panes and made the lamps flicker. The snow outside pressed higher, slowly climbing the glass. Downtown, the offices opened as usual. Clerks arrived early, their coats white with frost. They brushed snow from their shoulders, laughed softly at the weather, and set to work. By 9 o'clock, the laughter had faded. From the windows, they could see only white. The buildings across the street had vanished. By 10, the gas lamps were lit again to fight the darkness that had fallen in mid-morning. Trains stopped running. Switches froze. Engines stalled where they stood. Commuters on the elevated rail line were stranded, their cars rocking with each gust. The passengers sat wrapped in their coats, the windows crusted with ice, their breath clouding the air. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, silence filled the space between them. By noon, the temperature had dropped below freezing. The snow no longer drifted, it attacked, horizontal, fierce, driven by a wind that moved faster than a man could walk. Across the East River, the bridges disappeared into white. Ferries tried to cross, but turned back, the current too strong and the visibility too poor. The city was becoming an island within itself. In Brooklyn, men tied ropes around their waists before stepping outside, securing themselves to door handles and lamp posts. They moved through the blizzard one careful step at a time, guiding others by the line that connected them. Horses refused to move. Carts were abandoned. Footprints filled within seconds, erased as if no one had ever passed. Along the waterfront, ships strained against their moorings. Their rigging was coated in ice, their decks buried. Sailors shouted to one another through the storm, though the wind carried away most of the sound. A few ships broke free, drifting toward the harbor mouth, lost in the white horizon. The sea and the sky had become one continuous field of snow. In Manhattan, doors would not open. Snow had piled against them, sealing the buildings. People used shovels to carve tunnels out into the street. Some climbed through upper windows to reach the surface. The streets themselves had vanished. There was only uneven white stretching in every direction. Every sound was softened. Even the roar of the wind came as a deep vibration more than a noise. In the afternoon, the storm grew stronger still. The snow turned finer, sharper. It filled the air like dust, blinding anyone who stepped outside. The temperature continued to fall. People lost their way between one block and the next. A man could leave his doorway and vanish within minutes. A woman crossing a short street might find herself circling back to the same point without knowing it. The city had turned into a maze of snow and wind. At Central Park, the open fields became waves of white. Trees bent under the load. Branches snapped and disappeared beneath new layers. Somewhere within the park, a man walked alone. He was tall and wrapped in a dark coat. His name was Roscoe Conkling, once a senator, proud and accustomed to the strength of his own will. He had left his office downtown, refusing the offer of a carriage. He intended to walk home, a journey that would normally take an hour. He believed the storm would calm. Instead, it deepened. He pressed forward, the snow rising past his knees, his breath freezing on his beard. By nightfall, he was found near the edge of the park, half conscious, carried to shelter, his body stiff with cold. He would not recover. Elsewhere, others fought their own quiet battles. Policemen guided lost travelers through the storm. Doctors struggled to reach patients. Every step was a test against the wind. The ropes that men tied from door to lamp posts grew rigid with ice. The streets, once alive with movement and noise, were silent now, except for the endless sound of the storm. Inside the New York Herald office, editors watched the snow climb higher up the windows. They printed the day's edition anyway, though few would ever see it. The poem by Whitman appeared near the front. Its small lines about a dandelion and the promise of spring looked out from the page like something from another world. Outside, the snow pressed against the doors until the paperboys could not leave. The copies waited in stacks while the wind howled beyond the glass. Evening approached, though the light had not changed since morning. The city's lamps flickered weakly in the storm. Electric wires snapped and fell. Gas lights went out one by one. In the growing dim, people lit candles, their small flames trembling. Shadows moved across walls in soft shapes. The storm covered the sound of everything else. Somewhere downtown, a policeman wrapped his scarf around his face and stepped into the street. He leaned forward into the gale, holding his lantern close. The snow swept past him in long ribbons. He could not see more than a few feet. The air burned his eyes. He found a young woman collapsed near a doorway, half buried. He lifted her, carried her back to a nearby station. Her face was pale, her hair frozen to her coat. She lived. He went out again. The wind continued to rise through the night. Reports later said it reached 85 miles per hour. In the moment, it was impossible to measure. It was not a wind that blew, it was a constant force, moving in every direction at once. Windows shattered, signs tore from walls. Chimneys fell. The city bent beneath it. Even the strongest buildings seemed to sway. Across the river in Brooklyn, the rattle of the elevated rails ceased entirely. The line had frozen. Passengers abandoned the cars, climbing down into snow that reached their thighs. They formed small groups and tried to walk, guided by the faint glow of lamps in the distance. For some, the distance was too far. They rested and did not rise again. For others, the lights meant safety. A hotel, a store, any place where warmth remained. The doors opened to them without question. Inside, strangers shared blankets and food. The city had become a collection of small islands of light, each surrounded by storm. By midnight, nearly all movement had stopped. The ferry lines were silent. The trains lay frozen on their tracks. The telegraphs were dead. Communication between the cities of the East Coast had ended. New York stood alone, wrapped in white, its voice gone. Inside the weather office, the instruments had stopped recording. The men there sat together in dim light, listening to the walls shake. They could no longer send warnings or receive them. They could only wait. Throughout the city, the same waiting took shape. In apartments, boarding houses, hotels, and shelters, people sat near whatever heat they could find. The wind pressed against the buildings like a tide. Each gust sounded deeper than the last. The hours passed slowly, one indistinguishable from another. Outside, the snow climbed past the first-floor windows. The roads were gone, the fences were gone. The familiar world had dissolved into a single, unbroken field of white. By the final hours of that night, even the wind seemed to tire. Its voice lowered, though the snow still fell. The city, exhausted, settled into stillness. Fires burned low, candles melted to their base. The last of the carriages had long since stopped. Everything that could move had already come to rest. The mild winter had ended. The great storm had taken its place. In the morning, the city would awaken to a world remade by cold and silence. But for now, in the quiet hours between darkness and dawn, New York lay under the snow, breathing softly beneath the weight of the wind. The first white morning. Morning came without light. The sky and the earth were one color, soft and unbroken. It was Monday, March 12th, 1888. The city woke slowly, as though unsure whether it was morning at all. Windows were dim. Frost clung to every edge of glass. Behind those panes, the air was still. Fires had burned low during the night, and the rooms felt heavy with cold. When people tried to open their doors, most would not move. Snow had risen through the night until it pressed against the wood, sealing it. Those who managed to push through found themselves stepping into silence. The sound of the city had vanished. No wheels, no hooves, no voices. Only the faint, constant whisper of snow moving through the air. New York lay hidden beneath white hills. The familiar lines of the streets were gone. Stairs descended into drifts. Gas lamps appeared as small, dark stumps rising from the snow. Here and there, a window glowed faintly, where a candle still burned, the flame trembling against the cold. In the lower part of Manhattan, a few early risers tried to reach their shops. They carried shovels, carving narrow trenches through the snow, moving slowly, breath turning to mist. Above them, the elevated railway stood motionless. Its steel beams were wrapped in ice, the cars frozen in place, hanging over a city that could no longer move. At the harbor, ships sat trapped by wind and frost. The water between the docks had turned to slush, thick and gray, moving only when the tide shifted below it. Men who had stayed on their vessels overnight looked out at a world of white air. The ropes that tied them to the pier were stiff as iron. They could hear the faint groan of ice against the hulls, a sound like deep breathing. On Broadway, drifts had swallowed the storefronts. Signs were half buried. Windows at street level were blocked entirely. A few people leaned out from upper floors to look down. They saw a city that no longer resembled itself. The straight lines and corners were gone. Everything had become round, smooth, and unfamiliar. It was a city drawn in snow. At the New York Herald, the presses had gone quiet. The paper printed during the storm remained stacked near the door, unread. On the front page, Whitman's poem about the first dandelion looked out from the column, surrounded by news that no one would receive. The workers gathered near a stove, listening to the wind hum through the walls. Outside, the snow reached the windowsills. One man pressed his palm against the glass and felt the vibration of the storm still passing above. In small apartments across the city, families stayed close together. Coal was running low. Many had burned whatever they could find during the night. Old boxes, broken furniture, the last pieces of wood meant for spring repairs. The smell of smoke mixed with the cold air that crept through the seams. Children slept under coats, their faces covered by scarves. The sound of the wind had softened now, a distant rhythm like the sea. By mid-morning, the air was filled with a pale glow that gave no warmth. The snow had stopped falling for a moment, but the drifts stood higher than fences and doors. People began to dig paths, small dark figures against the vast white. They worked without speaking, shovels cutting into the snow with slow, even strokes. Every movement felt heavy. The cold pressed through gloves and sleeves, settling into the bones. From the upper windows of a hotel on Fifth Avenue, a man watched the scene below. He saw a single figure moving through the street, bent forward, wrapped in cloth from head to foot. The figure disappeared behind a drift, then appeared again, climbing upward, pulling a small sled. The man watched until the shape vanished behind the curve of another street, swallowed by distance and white air. Inside the city's hospitals, doctors moved between wards lit by lanterns. There was little they could do but keep the fires alive. Nurses wrapped blankets around those who had been brought in from the storm. Some were frostbitten, their hands pale as paper. Others were exhausted from the cold. The sound of quiet breathing filled the rooms. Outside, the wind continued its steady song. As the morning passed, the snow began to fall again, fine, dry, endless. The flakes drifted sideways, so light they seemed to float without ever landing. Through them, the city appeared and disappeared, half visible, half imagined. No one knew how long the storm would last. Time had slowed. Clocks ticked, but the sound was faint, lost under the wind. By noon, the stillness deepened. The city seemed to hold its breath beneath the snow. The wind had eased, leaving a silence that felt wide and weightless. From high rooftops, sheets of snow slid down slowly, falling without sound. The air was filled with small drifting flakes that moved like dust in sunlight. Nothing was sharp, nothing hurried. Every outline was softened, every motion quiet. People began to appear along the streets, emerging from doors that opened only part way. They stepped carefully into the whiteness, sinking to their knees. Voices were low and slow, muffled by scarves and air. Neighbors greeted one another, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with a brief word. Each person carried a shovel, a bucket, or simply their hands, clearing small spaces near their doors. Paths formed, little by little, curving between walls of snow that rose taller than a man. Along the harbor, ships lay silent. Their masts and rigging were sheathed in ice, the sails bound tight. The river itself was hidden beneath gray frozen waves. Seagulls rested on the edges of the docks, feathers puffed, motionless against the wind. The world seemed paused between storm and calm, as if deciding whether to move again. In the business district, the windows of tall buildings glowed faintly from within. The gas burned low to save supply. Men stood in their coats around stoves, speaking softly about the weather, about the trains that had not arrived, about the mails that would not come. They knew now that this storm was not like the others. But the realization brought no urgency, only a kind of quiet acceptance. They waited. At the city's markets, the stalls were buried. Fruit, vegetables, bread, all gone or frozen. A few shopkeepers opened their doors, handing out what they could to those who came. Money meant little in that moment. Hands exchanged food, not coins. People nodded, murmured thanks, and disappeared again into the white. The generosity was small but steady, like embers under snow. On the avenues near Central Park, horses stood blanketed in frost, their reins hanging loose. Drivers covered their faces with scarves, their eyes narrow against the glare. The snow reflected every bit of light that reached it. The air itself seemed to shine. At the park gates, drifts had reached the top of the fences. The statues were half buried, their shapes softened until they looked almost alive, emerging from the snow like quiet guardians. Inside homes, fires burned low. Coal supplies were dwindling. Some families shared their heat, opening doors between apartments to let warmth pass through. The scent of wood smoke filled the hallways. Children drew on frosted windows with their fingers, small circles that melted briefly before freezing again. The silence of the storm made every sound seem close. The crack of wood, the hiss of the fire, the soft shifting of blankets. In one small grocery shop on the Lower East Side, the owner, Mr. Finkelstein, kept his doors open for those who needed shelter. The space was dim, lined with shelves of jars and cans. Several families gathered there, sitting together among the crates. A woman named Sarah Goldstein held her children near the stove, her breath forming clouds in the air. Someone poured warm tea from a dented pot. The warmth was faint, but enough. They spoke little. Outside, the wind brushed against the door like a long, slow sigh. As the day continued, the city above and below the snow seemed to merge. Tunnels formed where people dug paths from house to house. The air inside these tunnels was still and faintly warm from the breath of those who passed through. Children carried small candles to light the way. The snow walls shone with reflected gold from the flame, soft and trembling. Every movement was slow. The world had shrunk to a few narrow paths and a pale sky. At the Weather Bureau, the instruments were silent now. The men who worked there had done what they could. They kept logs by hand, marking the hours and the fall of snow when the wind allowed them to see. Outside their windows, the storm moved without pattern or end. They wrote the same word again and again, snowing steadily. It was all there was to say. In the afternoon, a faint color returned to the sky. It was not blue, only a lighter shade of gray. The wind turned north and the air grew drier. The snowflakes became smaller, the spaces between them wider. For the first time in nearly 2 days, a soft light touched the tops of the buildings. It was pale and cold, but enough to reveal the shape of the world again. People paused to look upward. They saw rooftops gleam, the air clear slightly, the horizon faintly visible. The sight brought no cheer, only quiet recognition that the storm had begun to fade. They stood in silence for a while before returning to their shovels. The work continued, slow and careful. By late afternoon, the sky deepened again. The light that had returned slipped away without sunset. Darkness rose evenly from the ground, blending with the gray sky until there was no line between them. Lamps flickered behind frosted glass. Snow glowed faintly beneath them, pale gold, fading into white. The wind whispered through the narrow spaces of the city, softer now, like a memory of itself. Inside the homes and shelters, people rested. Some slept sitting up, wrapped in blankets. Others watched the slow play of shadows on the walls. Every breath formed a small cloud in the cold air. The day ended as quietly as it had begun. New York lay still beneath its cover, waiting for morning to show what had survived the night. Night returned without stars. A thin layer of cloud drifted across the sky, hiding the moon. Snow still fell in small, dry flakes that glimmered for an instant and disappeared. The air had lost its weight. It felt lighter now, almost hollow, as though the storm had emptied it of sound. In the harbor, the ice moved with the tide. It cracked softly, a low rhythm that came and went beneath the surface. Ships remained anchored, their ropes thick with frost. The lamps along the piers burned faintly through the haze, reflections trembling on the frozen water. The world seemed suspended in a single slow breath. Along the narrow streets, people moved again. Some carried lanterns that cast round circles of light on the snow. The glow revealed shapes of fences, carts, and signs buried to their edges. children followed their parents, stepping in their tracks, holding onto sleeves. Each movement left a mark that filled almost as soon as it was made. Inside one of the police stations near Mulberry Street, several officers warmed their hands over a small stove. Their uniforms were damp, their boots white with frost. Now and then, they opened the door to let in those who knocked. The room filled quickly. Men and women sat close together on benches and the floor. Steam rose from wet coats, and melted snow gathered in small puddles that froze again near the doorway. Someone brewed tea over the fire. The sound of quiet voices replaced the sound of wind. Across the river in Brooklyn, the pattern was the same. Stores had become shelters. Hotels opened their lobbies to strangers. Everywhere, people shared what warmth they had. Outside, the snow lay higher than windowsills. Icicles hung from roofs like clear curtains, motionless in the cold. In the upper stories of the city, where the snow reached only the ledges, life continued in small, careful ways. Families watched from above as the white streets slowly took shape again. A man tapped on the glass to loosen frost, then leaned close to see a faint line of footprints below. For a moment, he could not tell whether they were moving toward him or away. Then the light shifted, and the prints disappeared beneath new snow. The hours after midnight passed quietly. Somewhere a clock struck once and then stopped. The hands froze in place, caught in ice. Candles burned to their base and went out. The rooms fell into shadow, soft and colorless. The city seemed to sleep with open eyes, its windows pale under the sky. Farther north, in small towns beyond the city, telegraph lines lay on the ground, their wires curved under frost. The poles stood like bare trees. No message could travel. The world had gone silent from Washington to Boston, each place wrapped in its own quiet snow. Only the wind moved between them, carrying nothing but cold air. By the last hour before dawn, the storm had truly ended. The snow no longer fell. It drifted only when the wind touched it. A thin brightness began to rise behind the clouds. Not yet daylight, but something close. The air smelled clean, stripped of smoke and dust. The rooftops shone faintly, a smooth silver that marked the first sign of clear sky. When the morning came, it came gently. No sun, no blue, only a soft illumination that revealed distance again. The outlines of buildings returned. The river glimmered faintly through a veil of mist. The silence that had covered the city for so long began to lift, though slowly, as if reluctant to go. Doors opened one by one. People stepped out, blinking against the light. They looked around without speaking, seeing how the world had changed shape overnight. The city that had once been sharp and loud was now rounded and quiet. Snow curved over every surface, filling the spaces between rails and fences, between stone and street. Nothing was lost. It was simply hidden. Far off, a bell rang, once not a signal, only the sound of metal against cold air. The note lingered, then faded into the distance. It marked the beginning of another day. The first white morning had arrived, calm and complete. The city lost in the storm. Morning light drifted across a city that no longer looked like itself. The storm had passed, but its silence remained. Snow filled the streets from wall to wall, soft and unbroken except for narrow trenches cut by shovels. The outlines of wagons, fences, and doorways were buried. New York had become a landscape of smooth hills and white valleys. From the upper windows, smoke rose in thin, straight lines, moving slowly into the pale air. Fires burned behind brick walls, their glow faint and steady. The sound of the wind was gone. In its place came only the creak of settling snow and the occasional soft collapse of a drift sliding from a roof. Each sound carried far, echoing in the wide stillness. Men appeared first, stepping carefully into the narrow paths they had carved the day before. They carried shovels made heavy by ice. Some worked to free doorways, others to reach neighbors trapped behind high banks. The work was slow and methodical. No one spoke loudly. Each breath showed in the air, hung there for a moment, and vanished. Along Broadway, the elevated railway stood silent. The rails were invisible beneath a crust of ice. The cars, frozen in place since Monday morning, hung above the street like relics. Their windows were coated with frost. Inside them, empty seats glimmered faintly in the half-light. Telegraph poles leaned at odd angles, the wires draped and broken. Communication with the world beyond the city had ended. No messages came, no signals left. For the first time in memory, New York stood apart, alone within its own boundaries. In the lower part of the city, the harbor was sealed. Ice stretched from pier to pier. Ships rested motionless, their hulls locked in place. Sailors walked across decks made slippery with frost, their footsteps echoing hollow beneath the masts. Farther out, a few small vessels tilted under the weight of snow, ropes frozen in wide arcs against the gray sky. The markets were closed. The smell of smoke and coal hung in the air, faint but constant. Those who had food shared it quietly with others. Bread, potatoes, and salted meat changed hands without price. In one street, a baker opened his doors and handed out loaves until his shelves were bare. He said nothing, only nodded as each person took a piece and moved away through the snow. Near Union Square, a hotel lobby filled with travelers who had been caught between trains. The stoves glowed red. Chairs and tables had been pushed aside to make room for blankets on the floor. Children slept beside strangers. A man read aloud from the day-old paper that someone had carried in from before the storm. The words were quiet, absorbed more by the warm air than by the listeners. At the same time, on the east side, narrow tenements stood buried almost to their second floors. The roofs bent slightly under the weight. Families opened attic windows to clear a way out, passing buckets of snow from hand to hand until a small tunnel formed to the light. From the street below, faint laughter drifted upward as neighbors called to one another through walls of snow. Even within the hardship, the tone was soft, unhurried. Throughout the day, the temperature remained low. Frost gathered on every metal surface, glinting like glass. The sky stayed the color of ash, smooth and still. Once, for a brief moment, the clouds parted. A small round sun appeared, white and distant. Its light touched the snow and made it shine as if from within. Then the clouds closed again, and the brightness faded, leaving behind a memory of warmth. In the City Hall building, officials met in dim rooms. Maps lay across tables, covered with thin layers of frost, brought in on coats and boots. There was little to discuss but waiting. Trains could not move, the ferries could not cross, and the telegraph lines were dead. All they could do was mark the day and the hour in ledgers. Outside their windows, snow continued to drift from one rooftop to another in a slow dance that never seemed to end. As afternoon came, groups of men began to clear the main avenues. They worked in long rows, lifting snow onto wagons pulled by horses wrapped in heavy blankets. Each wagon moved only a short distance before the wheels sank. The progress was steady but small, a rhythm of shovel, lift, pause, breathe. Spectators watched from windows, faces pale behind the glass. When evening approached, the faint color of light faded to gray. Lamps were lit again, their glow reflecting off the snowbanks in soft halos. The city looked peaceful from above, a pattern of dim golden circles connected by narrow dark paths. It was quiet enough to hear the slow beat of hooves on packed snow, the rare sound of a single wagon returning from a delivery. Everything else rested. Night settled again, slow and even. The air had grown colder as the day faded. Windows shone softly through frost, small lights floating above the white streets. Inside, stoves burned with steady orange heat. Outside, the snow reflected that light, so the city seemed to glow faintly from within. People rested where they were. Travelers who had sought shelter in hotels remained there for another night. Families shared rooms, spreading blankets across the floor. The sound of quiet voices mixed with the creak of wooden beams cooling in the cold. Every building carried the faint sound of wind slipping through its edges. Along the harbor, lanterns swayed above the ice. Men kept watch through the hours, marking the tide's slow movement beneath the frozen surface. Here and there, the muffled groan of shifting ice rose and faded again, like a low note from far below the water. The ships stood still, each one surrounded by a white border of frozen spray. In the middle of the city, police stations and firehouses had become places of rest. People arrived with faces pale from frost, boots covered in frozen slush. Blankets were passed around. Someone prepared a small pot of soup over a coal stove, its scent drifting through the room. The mood was quiet, almost hushed. No one spoke of the storm anymore. It was already behind them, though its weight still pressed against every wall. Through the night, the city changed again. The snow that had fallen now began to settle, packing itself under its own weight. On rooftops, it hardened into smooth, unbroken layers. Icicles lengthened along window frames, catching what little light the lamps provided. Every shape, every surface seemed sculpted into stillness. By morning, Tuesday, March 13th, the sky was pale and flat. The storm was gone, completely. In its place remained a calm so deep that it felt like a new world. Smoke from chimneys rose straight up without wavering. The air held a quiet clarity that made every sound distinct. A footstep, a door closing, a shovel striking snow. People began to move again. The narrow paths they had carved earlier widened. From these small corridors, figures emerged, dark against the white. Their voices carried softly, muffled but steady. The first carts appeared, pulled by teams of horses. Each wheel turned slowly, leaving deep, clean tracks that filled with glimmering frost. In Central Park, the trees stood motionless. Their branches, coated in ice, sparkled faintly as the light shifted. The ground was hidden under a smooth sheet that stretched unbroken across the open fields. Footsteps left dark impressions that filled gradually with a fine powder blown from above. It looked as if the landscape were breathing, erasing and remaking itself with each sigh of air. Somewhere near the park's edge, workers uncovered a bench completely buried since Monday morning. Its iron frame was white and cold to the touch. They brushed it clean and rested for a while, sitting in silence. Around them, the city stretched wide and unfamiliar. The sound of their breathing and the scrape of shovels were the only marks of movement in a world otherwise still. On the bridges leading out of Manhattan, snow lay in heavy drifts. Travel was nearly impossible. Men with ropes crossed slowly, testing each step. Their breath rose in small clouds and drifted away. Below, the river was a frozen plain, broken only by channels of dark water that shifted with the tide. The sound that came from it was slow and steady, a soft cracking followed by silence. Inside homes, letters were written by lamplight. People recorded what they had seen, what they had lost. Some wrote to relatives in other cities, though they could not yet send the messages. Telegraph lines still hung silent. But the act of writing brought a kind of peace, as if putting words on paper helped measure the stillness that filled the days. In one of the few newsrooms still operating, a reporter walked from window to window, describing what he saw in his notes. He wrote about the snowdrifts that covered street signs, the carriages half buried near the station, and the strange quiet that lingered even when people returned to the streets. His tone was plain, his sentences short. He knew the story itself needed no height or weight beyond what had already happened. Afternoon came with a faint silver light. The air remained cold enough that nothing melted. Children began to play in the narrow lanes their parents had cleared, shaping the snow into rounded forms, sliding down small slopes between the drifts. Their laughter carried through the quiet neighborhoods like an echo from another season. Adults paused to watch them before turning back to their work. By evening, the lamps were lit once more. The glow settled across the snow in soft patterns. From above, the city looked calm and even, a scatter of warm dots surrounded by white. The wind had not returned. Only the faint hum of distant movement marked the passing of the night. As darkness spread once more, the city glowed in small, steady points of light. The lamps along the avenues created soft halos that reached only a short distance through the frozen air. Snow absorbed every sound, making the night feel deeper than it was. In the quiet, footsteps echoed clearly, then faded, as if swallowed by the streets themselves. Inside, families prepared for another long night. Some had managed to gather more coal from the wagons that began to move again. Others burned scraps of wood or paper to keep the flame alive. The rooms were dim, the light thin and amber. Shadows moved across walls like slow waves. Children slept early, their faces calm, their breathing soft beneath layers of blankets. At one of the large train stations, workers cleared snow from the platforms. They used long boards and ropes, passing the piles from hand to hand, hour after hour. The rails beneath them were hidden, the switches frozen. Engines waited, covered in frost, their black shapes faintly silver in the lantern light. When the wind stirred, it lifted a thin mist of powder that drifted through the air like smoke. Near the harbor, the sound of breaking ice marked the tide's return. The water moved slowly beneath its shell, pressing upward, cracking the edges of the frozen surface. Pieces of ice shifted and turned, their edges glowing faintly where the lanterns touched them. A few sailors leaned on the rails of their ships, watching in silence. They spoke little. The sea would be open again soon, but not yet. In the middle of the city, the snow had hardened. Paths cut earlier in the day had turned to narrow corridors of ice. People moved carefully through them, carrying small bundles of food or wood. Each step echoed against the walls of snow. Sometimes two figures met in a crossing and paused, nodding to one another before continuing in opposite directions. The city felt both small and endless at once. By midnight, a light fog rose from the ground. It hovered low, glowing faintly under the lamps. Through it, the shapes of buildings seemed to float, detached from the streets below. The scene was still, dreamlike. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and cold iron. The snow reflected the light upward, softening the edges of everything it touched. Inside a small hotel near Madison Square, the guests gathered in the dining room. They sat close to the stove, wrapped in blankets and coats. Someone played a few slow notes on a piano that had gone slightly out of tune. The sound filled the room like a low hum. A woman poured warm milk into cups. No one spoke for a long while. The warmth, the sound, and the soft rhythm of the keys were enough. Far uptown, in houses with larger fires, the scene was similar. Servants moved quietly between rooms, carrying kettles and tending to embers. Outside the tall windows, the world was entirely white. There was no color except for the faint gold of the flames reflected in the glass. It felt as though the city had been folded into silence. Toward morning, the fog lifted. A faint breeze moved across the river, and the ice cracked again, sharper this time. The first clear sound in many days rang through the air, the call of a ship's bell, dull and distant. It marked the shift from night to dawn. Light came slowly, spilling through the clouded sky. The snow that covered the city began to glitter in pale silver tones. The rooftops glowed, the narrow paths shimmered faintly. Smoke from chimneys rose straight and white. The sky deepened to a softer gray, and for the first time since the storm began, the horizon could be seen. People stepped outside to look. They stood still, their breath rising in clouds. The city was changed, but it was whole. What had been hidden was now visible again. The air was quiet, open, and clean. The world for the moment had stopped moving, not in fear, not in loss, but in rest. The night of the lights. Evening came quietly. The light of day faded behind a pale curtain of cloud, leaving the city wrapped in a faint silver haze. Snow still covered every street, but now its surface had hardened, smooth and cold. When footsteps crossed it, the sound was soft and hollow, like a whisper through paper. The air carried no wind. It was still enough that the smoke from the chimneys rose straight upward before dissolving into the low sky. Inside the houses and shelters, lamps were lit one by one. Small golden circles appeared in the windows, scattered across the white landscape. From a distance, the city looked like a field of quiet stars, each one trembling slightly behind glass. The warmth of the light seemed fragile, held together only by the calm that followed the storm. In the larger buildings near Broadway, gas lamps flickered to life. Men moved along the streets, lighting them with long poles. The glow spread slowly, reaching from corner to corner. It reflected off the snowbanks and returned upward, soft and steady. For the first time in days, people could walk after dark, without lanterns of their own. They moved carefully, their shadows sliding beside them on the snow. The air inside the hotels was filled with the smell of coal and damp wool. Guests gathered near stoves and shared stories in low voices. Most spoke of simple things: food, warmth, the work that would begin again once the tracks and bridges were clear. The tone was calm, the words plain. There was no excitement in them, only the slow rhythm of relief. Across the river in Brooklyn, the same soft light shone from the windows of row houses. Families sat together near the fire, the sound of crackling wood the only movement in the room. Outside, icicles hung like glass ribbons, motionless in the frozen air. The street lamps cast long, still shadows across the snow. Everything seemed balanced between night and morning, between silence and the slow return of life. At the harbor, lanterns lined the piers. They burned in a row, their reflections trembling on the dark water between the ice. Sailors checked the ropes that held their ships. The tide moved quietly, pushing against the frozen edges with soft, rhythmic cracks. Some of the men leaned on the rails and watched the city lights shimmer across the water. The sight was calm and unfamiliar. A city hushed beneath snow, glowing only from within. Farther inland, in neighborhoods where the streets were narrow, the lamps shone low against the walls. The snow there was higher, the paths winding and uneven. Children stood by the windows, watching the light move through the haze, tracing faint golden lines across the air. When a gust passed, the glow blurred for a moment, then cleared again, steady as before. It was as if the city itself was learning to breathe again. In the police stations, the lamps burned late. Officers sat near the doors, their boots drying by the fire. On the tables lay small piles of lost items, gloves, scarves, letters found in the snow. Each was set aside to be returned when the time came. No one spoke loudly. The quiet had become a habit now, part of the air. At a small bakery near the Bowery, the ovens had begun to burn again. The scent of bread drifted through the cold streets, mixing with the smell of coal smoke. A few people followed it to the door. The baker handed out loaves one at a time, his hands dusted with flour. Steam rose from the bread into the night, curling upward toward the lamps above the doorway. For a while, that simple warmth filled the street more surely than light itself. As the hours passed, the city grew softer. Snow along the rooftops caught the glow of the lamps and sent it back into the sky. The outlines of buildings blurred. The night seemed endless but gentle. Those who looked out through their windows saw only white and gold, still and balanced. For the first time since the beginning of the storm, peace had weight again. The night deepened slowly. The air outside the windows turned a softer shade of gray, almost blue. Snow no longer fell, but the sky kept its color, pale and close, like fabric stretched above the rooftops. The city glimmered beneath it, lights scattered evenly in every direction. They did not flicker now. They held steady, each one quiet, in its own small circle of warmth. At the corner of Broadway and 23rd Street, a man guided his horse-drawn wagon through the cleared path. The wheels turned with a low creak. He carried bundles of coal to the houses that still needed heat. Each stop was marked by a knock, a brief exchange, the dull sound of a shovel. His breath rose in clouds that drifted behind him like smoke. When he finished, he rested his hand on the horse's neck for a moment before moving on. In the station houses, messages were written by lamplight. Runners were sent through the narrow passages that connected one precinct to another. Their boots left faint prints that filled quickly with frost. The messages were simple: reports of roads opened, supplies delivered, families accounted for. Each paper carried a small trace of soot from the lamps that had dried the ink. When they reached their destination, the soot left a smudge that looked almost like a fingerprint. Along the avenues, windows glowed with the color of candlelight. The glass was lined with frost on the outside, but inside, the air was calm and golden. People sat near tables, writing, mending, or simply watching the flame. A few musicians, trapped by the storm and its long aftermath, played quiet melodies to pass the time. The sound drifted upward, soft and steady, blending with the hush of the snow. It was not music for listening. It was music for being still. At a theater near Union Square, the doors were open again for the first time since the storm began. The stage was dark except for a single lamp that shone over the empty chairs. A small group of workers swept the aisles, clearing away dust and bits of melted snow brought in on boots. Their movements were slow, unhurried. Outside, the streetlights threw pale shapes through the windows, making the room glow in soft patterns. No audience waited. The quiet was enough. Elsewhere, in the narrow streets by the river, the warehouses were silent. Inside, boxes and barrels stood stacked to the ceiling. A single watchman made his rounds, his lantern cutting a small path through the shadows. He paused at each door to listen. The sound he heard was always the same, a long, faint hum of air moving between walls. It was the sound of a city breathing in its sleep. Across the river in Brooklyn, lights burned late in the workshops, where men repaired the damage left by the storm. Tools rested neatly in rows. Water had frozen in the buckets near the doors. When one of the workers spoke, his voice left a cloud in front of him. They worked in silence most of the time, pausing only to warm their hands over small fires made in iron barrels. The glow of those fires reflected in their eyes, steady and calm. The ferry docks were still closed. The water between them had begun to move again, but slowly under a thin sheet of ice. Lanterns marked the edges, each one trembling with the faint motion of the current. A watchman walked along the pier, the wooden boards creaking beneath his boots. Each step sent a hollow echo through the fog. He stopped often to look back toward the city, where the faint golden glow spread evenly along the horizon. It was quiet enough that he could hear his own breath. In the upper floors of a building near Madison Avenue, a woman sat by a window, looking down at the street. She had lit a single lamp beside her chair. Its light reflected on the frost-covered glass, creating the illusion of another lamp outside, shining back toward her. She watched it for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the wind along the roof. When she finally stood to close the curtain, the reflection disappeared, leaving the window dark and smooth. The hours passed without measure. Each moment seemed to extend gently into the next, without edges or weight. The city existed between motion and stillness, its lights fixed like stars in low clouds. In that quiet balance, people slept more deeply than they had since before the storm. The air was cold, but it was steady, predictable. It was a kind of peace that felt earned rather than given. Past midnight, the lamps along the streets continued to burn, each one surrounded by a soft halo of mist. The snow beneath them had frozen smooth, turning every step into a quiet echo. Shadows drifted slowly across the pale ground, as if time itself had learned to move more gently. Above, the sky was clear now, open and deep. A few stars shone faintly, their light dimmed by the lingering haze from the city's breath. The air was so still that even the faintest sound carried far. Somewhere a door closed softly. Somewhere else, a distant bell rang once and faded. The sound traveled through the streets like a ripple across water. It did not disturb the silence, it became part of it. Inside the printing house of a small newspaper, a single press turned. Its slow rhythm echoed through the empty building. The men working there moved in silence, setting type, feeding sheets, stacking them one by one. The words they printed were simple reports of clear skies, lists of reopened roads, the promise of mail arriving soon. Each page left the press still warm, the ink shining faintly under the gaslight. Outside, the snow reflected that same faint glow back toward the windows. Farther uptown, near the edge of the park, another kind of light appeared, lanterns, carried by workers, clearing branches, broken under the snow's weight. They moved through the trees like small moving stars, their light touching bark and ice, flashing briefly before vanishing again. The sound of shovels against frozen ground echoed softly between the trunks. It was a steady rhythm, almost musical, repeating with the patience of hands that understood the value of slow work. Along Fifth Avenue, the lamps glowed brighter than before. The wind had polished the air to glass, and every light seemed sharper, more defined. The windows of the tall buildings shimmered with reflection gold within gold, layer upon layer of quiet brightness. A few carriages moved slowly through the cleared paths, the horses' hooves striking the ground with measured certainty. The drivers sat high and still, their silhouettes dark against the snow. At a corner cafe, the doors were open again for the first time. Inside, the small room smelled of coffee and warm bread. Only a few people sat at the tables, their coats still dusted with frost. They spoke in low voices, the words drifting like smoke above the cups. From the ceiling, a single lamp cast light in a circle that touched the edges of the room, then faded into shadow. It was enough. On the river, the fog lifted for a while, revealing the faint shimmer of water beneath the ice. The first ferries had not yet begun to move, but the air carried the promise of sound, the slow turn of machinery, the deep tone of engines waking from stillness. For now, though, the water remained calm. The lanterns on the piers burned in straight lines, their reflections trembling on the dark surface. Each one looked like a memory made visible. Toward dawn, the city's light changed. The lamps still burned, but the eastern sky had begun to pale. It was not the golden light of sunrise, but a gentle gray that softened the edges of everything it touched. Snow gleamed faintly, rooftops glowed, and the long shadows that had stretched through the night began to fade. The air no longer bit at the skin, it simply rested there, cool and thin. They opened their windows a little, letting the faint morning air drift inside. The world beyond the glass looked softer now, washed clean of sharpness. The lamps flickered once, then were extinguished one by one as the daylight spread. The sound of life returned gradually, the creak of wagons, the low call of voices, the far hum of movement beginning again. By the time the first sunbeam reached the tops of the buildings, the night of the lights had ended. It left behind a city quiet but alive, its glow replaced by the soft shimmer of morning. The snow no longer seemed heavy. It lay gently across the roofs and paths, as if resting, not restraining. From the harbor to the park, From the narrow lanes to the wide avenues, everything shone with a calm that could only come after silence. And though no one said it aloud, each person who looked out upon that light understood the city had not been defeated by the storm. It had simply learned to sleep, and now it was waking again, one breath at a time. The morning after. Morning returned without haste. It arrived as a pale shimmer spreading slowly across the snow, touching roofs, fences, and the tops of trees. The light was thin, colorless, but it brought shape back to the world. After so many days of white silence, the city seemed to draw its first full breath again. The air carried a faint smell of smoke, softened by frost. Every sound felt distant, a door closing, the muffled rhythm of hooves, the call of someone unseen. The streets were still heavy with snow, but the paths had widened, curving like streams between the tall banks. In those narrow lanes, people began to move quietly, their steps slow, deliberate, almost cautious, as though afraid to disturb the calm that had settled overnight. At the harbor, thin wisps of mist rose from the water where the tide had cracked the ice. Seagulls glided low, wings catching the pale light. The ships stood still, but no longer trapped. Their hulls creaked softly, a sound that seemed to mark the turning of time itself. Men moved along the decks, shaking frost from ropes, testing the anchors. They worked without hurry, their movements gentle, steady, almost ritual. On Broadway, the gas lamps were still burning when the first sunlight touched them. Their flames paled, shimmered, then vanished. Shadows stretched along the snow, long and thin. The shop windows, once dark, reflected the light like pools of glass. Behind some of them, figures moved, shopkeepers brushing snow from doorways, sweeping steps clean, opening shutters that had been closed for days. The city was quiet, but it was no longer asleep. The storm had taken its noise away, then returned it in softer form, a rhythm of slow movement, careful voices, and the faint clatter of tools. Steam rose from the grates along the streets, curling into the cold air before fading. It looked almost alive, a slow breath lifting from the earth. In the markets, wagons began to arrive. Their wheels turned unevenly through the snow, iron rims striking the frozen ground. The drivers wore scarves wrapped high over their faces. They called to each other in low voices, their words carried away by the still air. Crates were unloaded apples, bread, coffee, flour, each one handled as if it were something rare and fragile. The sound of wooden boxes striking stone was soft but sure, a rhythm of return. At the corner of a quiet street, a small schoolhouse stood half buried under snow. Inside, the stove burned low. A woman arranged chairs, brushed dust from the blackboard, and opened the door to let in the new light. Outside, a few children waited, scarves pulled up to their noses. They stepped in quietly, their boots leaving dark, wet prints on the wooden floor. The woman smiled, though her face was tired. When they sat, she read aloud from a small book, not a lesson, only a poem about spring. Her voice was low and even, blending with the crackle of the fire. For a moment, the world beyond the windows disappeared. Throughout the city, the snow began to change color. In places touched by sunlight, it softened, turning from hard white to a faint silver gray. Drops of water formed along railings and edges of roofs, falling in slow, measured rhythm. Each drop left a tiny mark, a sound like a whisper against the stillness. It was not melting yet, only dreaming of it. At the post office, men sorted letters by lamplight. The piles were high, unopened since before the storm. Some envelopes were damp, others sealed in frost. The workers moved carefully, warming each stack near the stove, before tying them with string. The first deliveries would not go far, only across a few streets, but it was enough to make the world feel connected again. Down near the river, where the bridges met the shore, the snow was darker from soot and salt. Footprints crossed in every direction, small and large, fresh and fading. The pattern looked like handwriting, endless and gentle. The river itself was quiet, carrying thin sheets of ice that turned slowly in the current. When sunlight touched them, they gleamed for a moment, then vanished beneath the surface. By midday, the city had found a kind of rhythm again. Horses moved through the narrow streets, wagons followed behind. The sound of iron shoes striking frozen ground became the city's new heartbeat, slow, steady, certain. Children leaned from windows to watch the carts pass. Their laughter was faint, but clear, a bright thread weaving through the still air. By early afternoon, sunlight deepened over the city. It was not warm, but it was constant, filling the air with a clear brightness that felt new. Shadows shortened, softened, and folded quietly along the snowbanks. The wind had not yet returned. The world seemed to hold itself in balance, silent, still and waiting. Near Union Square, people began to gather, not in crowds, only in small groups, each moving carefully through the narrow paths between the drifts. They spoke little, pausing often to look around. The trees in the square were heavy with frost, each branch glistening like fine glass. When the breeze touched them, a faint sound came, a brittle chime, as if the trees themselves were whispering. Vendors reopened their carts, brushing snow from the wheels. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through the air, mixing with the faint scent of coal smoke. A man sold newspapers printed that morning, the first since the storm began. The pages were thin and gray, the ink slightly blurred, but people bought them eagerly. They did not read at once. They folded the papers carefully, tucked them into coats, and carried them home like proof that the world was whole again. In a small apartment overlooking the East River, an old painter worked near the window. His brushes were stiff from cold, his paints frozen into dull, heavy colors. He warmed them slowly over the flame of a lamp until they softened. Then, on a scrap of canvas, he began to trace the shapes outside the river, the ships, the white roofs fading into pale sky. He painted without rush, letting the colors mix on their own like melting snow. The image that formed was quiet, empty, but full of light. He stopped often simply to look. Across the river in Brooklyn, workers cleared the tracks that led toward Manhattan. They moved in lines, their shovels cutting into the drifts with steady rhythm. Steam rose from their mouths and coats, catching the sunlight as they lifted and turned. The sound of their work echoed through the open space, deep and calm. When they paused to rest, they leaned on their shovels and looked toward the city, its skyline pale against the sky. For a moment, no one spoke. The sight of it still shining, recovered, was enough. In the afternoon markets, the sounds of trade returned softly. The clink of coins, the rustle of cloth, the murmur of quiet conversation. Nothing was hurried. Even the voices of the vendors were lower than before, as if the storm had taught the city to speak more gently. The rhythm of exchange was the same as it had always been, but the feeling was new, patient, measured, grateful. Children played in the narrow lanes, building small shapes from the softening snow. Their gloves were damp, their laughter bright but not sharp. They ran in circles, leaving patterns behind that vanished as soon as the wind moved. A few adults stopped to watch, smiling faintly before continuing their work. The sight of motion itself, free, light, harmless, seemed to ease the air. Inside the libraries and reading rooms, people gathered again. They sat in silence under the warm yellow glow of lamps, turning pages slowly. The sound of paper moving was gentle, steady. Some read about the storm, others about faraway places where the sun was still strong. It did not matter what the words said. It was enough that they could be read again, in peace. In the upper part of Manhattan, along the river's edge, a group of men set to clearing the paths toward the docks. They worked through the afternoon until their shovels struck wood and stone. The river ice cracked beside them, slow and rhythmic, like breathing. One by one, they cleared the steps leading down to the water. When the last shovel was lifted, they stopped and stood still, watching the faint light shift across the surface. It was not yet open water, but it was beginning. As evening approached, the sky changed once more. A thin layer of cloud drifted in from the west, glowing faintly pink against the fading blue. The snow reflected that color, turning soft rose and gold for a few minutes before dimming again. Windows caught the last light, shining like small fires. From every direction, smoke rose slowly, joining the clouds above. The lamps were lit again, one by one. Their glow spread across the white streets, calm and even. The city had found its rhythm, and with it, a kind of music that needed no sound, only the quiet pulse of life returning. From the harbor to the hills, New York breathed again, and the snow, now gentle and still, seemed to listen. By the time the lamps had fully brightened, the city felt calm again. The snow that had frightened it into stillness was now an afterthought, resting quietly at the edges of the streets. It had become part of the city, no longer something to fight against. The air held the scent of coal and fresh bread, a sign that the rhythm of life had returned. Inside the houses, families gathered for supper. The food was simple broth, bread, sometimes only tea, but there was comfort in the warmth, in the act of sitting together after so many days of waiting. Conversations moved slowly, voices low, as though no one wished to break the fragile peace that had settled between them. Children leaned against the table, their faces still pink from the cold outside. The glow of lamps turned the room soft and golden, and shadows swayed gently along the walls. On the streets, a few carriages moved now with more confidence. The wheels cut through the packed snow, leaving clear lines that curved into the distance. Each sound, a hoof striking stone, a door closing, a call from a driver, echoed longer than usual, as if the city were still learning to hold noise again. Those walking kept to the sides, moving steadily but without rush. They nodded to one another in passing, their breath rising in small clouds that lingered for a moment before fading. At the harbor, the first ferry bell rang. It was low and deep, the sound rolling slowly through the air until it reached the shore. Men on the piers turned to listen. It was not yet time for departure, but the bell meant readiness, a promise that movement would begin again soon. Ice drifted away from the posts, turning slowly in the current. The river looked alive once more, its surface dark and clear beneath the soft glow of the lamps. Farther inland, the city's newspapers began their work again. The presses turned, slow at first, then steady. The smell of ink filled the rooms. Sheets of paper slid through the rollers, each one carrying the same words: reports of calm, the first lists of trains expected to arrive, and notices of thanks for those who had kept watch through the storm. It was the story of recovery told without drama, printed in quiet black lines. Up along the avenues, church bells tolled the evening hour. Their sound was distant, drifting over rooftops and fading before it reached the river. It did not call people anywhere. It only marked time, reminding the city that another day had passed, whole and safe. In the windows, the lights shone steadily, reflected in the half-melted snow that still lined the streets. As night deepened, fog rose again from the river, carrying a faint shimmer that turned the air silver. Through it, the lights of the city softened, blurring into one another until everything seemed to glow from within. The noise had settled completely now. The city breathed in long, even intervals, like something alive and dreaming. From above, it would have looked like a sea of small stars, not distant, but close enough to touch. Inside a boarding house near Madison Street, a young man sat by the window, writing in a notebook. His pen moved slowly, pausing often between sentences. He wrote not about the storm, but about the silence that followed it, how the city had changed, how even its quiet felt different now, less heavy, more deliberate. When he finished, he closed the book and placed it beside the lamp. The flame flickered once, reflected in the glass, and went still. Midnight came softly. Snow began to fall again, not in storm, but as a quiet return. The flakes drifted through the air, small and bright, catching the lamplight as they passed. They did not gather or hide the world. They only reminded it of what had been. The city watched through half-open shutters and windows, unafraid. The storm was gone, but its memory had left something gentle behind, a patience, a rhythm, a calm that seemed to breathe beneath every surface. By dawn, the sky was clear once more. The first light moved across the river, through the empty streets, and up the sides of buildings still coated with frost. Every window caught the light and sent it back in pale reflections. The city woke slowly, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. The storm had passed. The long white silence was over. And as morning spread again across the roofs, New York stood in stillness, not broken, not triumphant, but at peace. The days of quiet work. The days that followed were slow and clear. The storm had passed into memory, leaving behind air so still that even smoke seemed reluctant to move. The sky was pale for hours, stretching wide above the city, without a trace of wind or cloud. Everything was touched by light, the streets, the rooftops, the bare branches, a gentle brightness that softened every shape. In the mornings, people rose early again. Fires were lit, stoves warmed, and the thin sound of kettles filled the quiet rooms. Outside, footsteps began. Before the sun climbed high, the steady rhythm of shovels and wheels returning to the streets. Snow still covered much of the ground, but paths had been cleared, long and straight, like veins through the white. Horses moved slowly, their breath rising in gray plumes that caught the light before fading. The city worked in silence. It was not the silence of fear now, but of focus, a deep, even calm that settled over every motion. Men repaired telegraph poles, lifting the fallen wires from the snow. The metal gleamed faintly as they worked, their voices low, their movements measured. From the rooftops, smoke rose in thin ribbons. Somewhere a hammer struck, again and again, until the sound became part of the air. Near the river, the ferries began to move once more. The first crossings were slow, cutting narrow paths through the ice. The water closed behind them, whispering against the hulls. Passengers stood on the decks, wrapped in coats, watching the city slide by in quiet reflection. The buildings along the shore looked taller now, their edges softened by light and distance. When the ferry reached the other side, no one hurried to leave. They stepped onto the pier in silence, as if afraid to disturb the calm the river had carried with it. Along the avenues, shopkeepers cleared their windows. The glass, cleaned of frost, shone with a new brightness. Inside, goods were arranged again, shelves repaired, lamps polished. Each movement was careful, deliberate. Coins changed hands. Papers were written. Pens moved slowly across ledgers. It was not the rush of commerce as before, but something gentler, a rhythm of rebuilding, of trust, returning step by step. At the printing houses, the presses ran through the afternoons. Their sound was steady, a deep rolling hum that filled the air without breaking it. Sheets of paper slid from the machines, stacked neatly in tall columns. The smell of ink and oil spread through the rooms. Outside, newsboys waited in the cold, their breath white against the air. When the bundles were handed out, they ran quietly through the streets, their calls soft and even. Even the news itself was simple reports of clear skies, of work resumed, of ships soon to sail again. Far uptown, in quieter neighborhoods, the snow melted more slowly. Icicles hung like glass threads from the eaves. When sunlight touched them, drops of water formed, falling in slow, even intervals. The sound was faint, but constant, a rhythm that marked time more gently than clocks. Children stood beneath them, holding their hands out to feel the water's chill. Their laughter was low and brief, swallowed quickly by the soft air. By afternoon, the color of the day deepened. The sky turned silver, and shadows stretched long across the streets. Work continued without pause. Men carried boards through alleys, women swept stoops clean of ice, carriages passed with slow, hollow sounds. It was a kind of harmony, a quiet pattern of movement that belonged only to these days. After the storm, nothing was hurried and nothing was still. The city seemed to move as one body, each part aware of the others, breathing together. The horizon glowed pale gold before fading to gray. The lamps were lit again, one by one, marking the paths home. Smoke curled upward in soft spirals. The snow reflected the light, turning it into a soft blanket of gold and white. Those walking home moved slowly, their faces calm, their thoughts low and even. Work had returned, but it carried with it no rush, only the steady comfort of routine restored. And as night came down, the city rested not exhausted, but content. The sound of work gave way to stillness, and the air cooled once more. Frost crept along the window edges, shaping patterns like faint writing on glass. Inside the rooms, lamps dimmed, and the last fires burned low. The city, tired but whole, breathed deeply again. The morning after was much the same. A pale light stretched across the roofs, touching the highest windows first. The frost that had gathered overnight shone faintly, then began to fade. From every street came the soft sound of footsteps beginning again. It was not a rush, but a steady pulse. The rhythm of the city finding itself in motion once more. Along the riverfront, smoke drifted from the chimneys of the workshops. Inside, men worked with coats still buttoned, breath misting in the cold air. Hammers struck metal in slow, deliberate patterns. The sound echoed off the walls and blended with the low hum of machinery. It was the sound of life returning in order, calm and sure. Outside the docks, crates were stacked in neat rows. Sailors shouted quietly to one another as they moved the cargo, their voices muffled by scarves. The ropes creaked, the planks groaned, the ice cracked softly beneath the weight of barrels and boots. The tide had begun to move freely now, small ripples glinting under the thin sunlight. Each ship that rocked gently at anchor seemed to breathe, waiting for the command to leave. In the heart of the city, wagons rolled slowly through the cleared avenues. The horses' hooves struck rhythmically, leaving dark circles where the ice had melted. Drivers nodded to one another as they passed. No one hurried. Every task felt measured. People paused at corners to watch the smoke rise from chimneys, as though taking quiet comfort in its steady climb. Inside the houses, daily life returned in soft gestures. Laundry hung near stoves to dry. Children played quietly with wooden toys. The air smelled faintly of tea and wood smoke. Even the ticking of clocks seemed slower, more patient. It was a kind of peace that required no words. At the post office, the first long-distance letters began to move again. Bundles were carried carefully through the snow to waiting wagons. The addresses, written in ink slightly blurred by cold, spoke of towns and cities, long out of reach. The workers handled each envelope gently, as if aware of the distance it would soon travel. Outside, the wheels of the mail carts made clean, parallel lines in the frost. The sound of their departure, a low, steady creak, was almost like a lullaby. Near Central Park, the trees still held their white covering. Paths wound between them, narrow and firm, under the weight of many feet. The park had become a place of quiet motion. People walked there not to speak, but simply to feel the stillness that remained. A few benches had been cleared of snow. Those who sat there did not stay long, only enough to watch the faint clouds drift above the treetops. By noon, the sunlight deepened. The city seemed washed clean, each brick and window sharper than before. Shadows moved slowly across the streets, long and soft-edged. At shop doors, bells rang faintly as customers came and went. Inside, the sound of small coins and folded paper blended with the murmur of conversation. It was the old life returning, but gentler, touched by something new, a patience, a quiet gratitude. On the outskirts of the city, fields still blanketed in snow stretched toward the horizon. Farmers moved along narrow paths, carrying feed to their animals, repairing fences, checking the barns. The cold was deep, but the air no longer bit sharply. Each breath felt clean, almost sweet. Above them, crows passed, low and silent, their wings catching the light like black silk. By the end of the afternoon, the sound of work softened again. Shovels rested against walls, tools were laid aside. The smoke from chimneys grew thicker, curling in dark shapes against the fading sky. Windows began to glow, first gold, then amber, then the soft white of gaslight. The streets dimmed but did not darken completely. The snow still held the light, reflecting it gently upward. People walked home in pairs or small groups. Their voices were low, their laughter quiet, their movements slow. The city no longer hurried toward anything. Each step seemed to find its own rhythm. The air between the buildings was still and faintly blue, touched by the last breath of daylight. When evening came, the lamps flickered on again. They lined the streets like a slow procession of stars. The snow beneath them glowed faintly, as though holding the day's warmth a little longer. From every direction came the sound of calm, not silence, but harmony. Wheels turning, water dripping, the sigh of wind against a shutter. The city, having endured, now moved as though it remembered how to rest. As night approached, a faint wind rose from the river. It carried the smell of salt and smoke, moving softly between the buildings. Snow drifted in small pieces from rooftops, sliding down the edges like slow rain. The lamps along the avenues glowed steadily, their light turning the air pale gold. Shadows stretched and folded into one another until the streets became ribbons of quiet color. Inside the workshops, the last hours of labor faded. Men wiped their hands, hung tools on hooks, and covered machines with cloth. The air still held the warmth of work, the scent of oil and iron. A single lantern remained burning in each room, casting a circle of yellow that trembled with each breath of wind. The stillness that followed was deep and kind, the sort that asks for no words. In the homes along the quieter streets, windows shone with steady light. Dinner tables were set. Chairs scraped softly against wood floors. The talk was low and even. Outside, the snow had begun to sparkle under the lamps, reflecting the faint colors of the rooms behind glass blue, amber, and gold. The sound of cutlery, of laughter under breath, drifted through the shutters and into the night air, blending with the hum of distant horses and wheels. Along the harbor, ships rocked gently in their berths. The tide had returned to its steady rhythm. Lanterns swayed above the decks, glowing like slow-moving fireflies. The water below them shimmered in narrow, broken lines. Each wave that touched the hull made a quiet sound, a sound of peace. Sailors leaned on the rails, watching the city's lights across the water. They spoke softly, their words lost to the wind before they could rise. In a small room above a print shop, a boy studied by candlelight. His book lay open beside a cup of tea gone cold. The candle flickered once, then steadied. Outside his window, flakes of snow moved slowly through the air, each one catching the glow before disappearing into the dark. He paused to watch them, his pen still in hand, and for a moment, the page before him seemed as calm and endless as the falling snow. Across the city, similar scenes unfolded, quiet, repeated, unremarkable, and perfect in their simplicity. A woman mended a coat by the fire. A man repaired a broken chair. A child whispered a story to a sibling half asleep. Each motion, each sound, belonged to the same rhythm, the rhythm of steady work, of living gently after hardship. The hours deepened. The snow that remained on rooftops glowed faintly beneath the moonlight, turning the city pale and soft. The wind brushed against shutters, then faded. A cat crossed a courtyard, its paws leaving small prints that vanished behind it. From time to time, a carriage passed, the bells on the horses ringing softly, marking the passage of night. Everything else was still. By midnight, the sky had cleared completely. Stars appeared faint at first, then bright, then countless. They seemed close enough to touch, as if the air itself had grown thinner after the storm. Their reflection shimmered in the slow-moving river, scattered like sparks across its dark surface. From the hills at the city's edge, one could see the quiet expanse of lights below. Not a sea of brilliance, but a patient glow, steady and alive. Inside the sleeping city, fires burned low. Each house kept its small center of warmth. The walls held the echoes of daytime work, the turn of a wheel, the scrape of a shovel, the rhythm of hands making and mending. Now those sounds were gone, leaving only breath, the soft creak of wood, the faint settling of the snow outside. The city, which had roared and suffered, now hummed softly in its sleep. Its heart beat evenly, like the tide, like a clock, like a song remembered from long ago. And within that great quiet, every soul, whether awake or resting, moved together, carried by the same calm air, the same patient rhythm of the days of quiet work. When the river spoke. The thaw began quietly. It did not come with rain or with warmth, but with a soft loosening of sound, the subtle shifting of ice beneath the surface of the river. Each day the current pressed a little harder, the frozen skin of the water bending, cracking, sighing as though it had been holding its breath too long. The city listened without knowing it was listening. The rhythm of work continued, but somewhere beneath the noise of wheels and shovels, a slower, older voice began to stir. At dawn, mist rose from the river's edge. It curled above the ice in thin gray ribbons, turning gold as the sunlight touched it. The air smelled faintly of salt and metal. Birds gathered along the docks again, their wings cutting through the haze in slow arcs. Each cry echoed against the wooden pilings, then faded into silence. The water, no longer still, began to whisper against the shore. Men who worked along the harbor noticed first. They heard the sound of ice breaking in the channels, a hollow, gentle crack that ran from one side to the other. It was not violent. It was patient. The river was speaking again after weeks of silence. Every sound was a word, every motion a phrase. The current, hidden so long beneath its frozen mask, was finding its voice. Small pieces of ice drifted toward the open water. They turned slowly in the tide, their surfaces bright with morning light. The ferries moved through them carefully, the engines humming low. Steam rose from the chimneys, spreading across the pale air like breath. Passengers stood on the decks, hands resting on the railings, watching the water shift and breathe. They did not speak. The sound of the river was enough. Up along the bridges, the view stretched wide and clear. The city gleamed below, clean and pale in the sunlight. The roofs were still white, but streaks of black showed where the snow had begun to slide away. From above, one could see the line where the frozen river met the living water, a boundary that moved, a conversation between two worlds. Each gust of wind carried a faint, low tone, not quite a song, not quite a sigh. It was the sound of the season turning. In the shipyards, workers paused to listen. The clatter of tools stopped. Some leaned on their shovels, others rested on crates, eyes turned toward the water. The sound that came from the river was strange but familiar, a rhythm too large to follow, too soft to measure. It was as if the earth itself were stretching, remembering its shape after long stillness. By noon, the current was strong enough to carry the ice away. Large pieces floated downriver, colliding softly, breaking apart in silence. Sunlight gleamed along their edges. The motion was slow but constant, a procession of light and movement that filled the wide channel. From the banks, people watched as the white fragments drifted toward the sea. They said nothing. Somehow the sight of water moving again made words unnecessary. In the lower city, the narrow streets smelled of thawing snow, a mix of earth, salt, and smoke. Drains began to murmur faintly as meltwater found its way through. The sound was small, hidden beneath the noise of footsteps, but it carried through the air like a promise. Even the smallest trickle felt alive, a sign that the stillness had finally broken. By late afternoon, the mist returned, softer now, pale and blue. It rose from the river and drifted through the streets, near the docks, wrapping around lamp posts and stairways. The lamps lit early, their glow spreading through the haze in gentle circles. The river's voice grew quieter as night approached, settling into a slow, even pulse. Ships rocked in the tide, ropes stretching, wood creaking in rhythm with the current. The city and the water seemed to breathe together, one deep inhale, one slow release. When darkness came, the river kept speaking, not in sound, but in movement, a steady glide beneath the stars. The ice was gone now, carried out to sea, and what remained was only reflection. The lights of the city trembled on the surface like scattered gold, changing shape with every ripple. It was as if the river had become a mirror for time itself, showing not what had passed, but what would continue. The next morning, the air was softer. The frost that had clung to every edge began to fade. On the windows, the thin patterns of ice melted into slow, clear lines that slid toward the sill. Drops gathered there, shining in the early light, before falling soundlessly to the floor. The world outside seemed to hum faintly, as if something hidden had awakened beneath the ground. Down at the harbor, the change was unmistakable. The river moved freely now, its surface dark and smooth, except where sunlight caught the crest of a wave. The sound of water lapping against the piers filled the air, calm and continuous. It was the first true voice of spring, low and patient. Each wave that touched the stone walls made a soft echo that traveled through the wooden planks of the docks and into the soles of every boot that stood there. Fishermen prepared their nets. Their boats rocked gently as they worked, ropes coiling neatly at their feet. The smell of salt and tar returned. When they pushed away from the pier, the oars dipped quietly into the water, leaving long ripples that stretched behind them. No one called out. There was no need. The river's steady rhythm guided them, keeping time with their strokes. In the city above, the thaw brought color back to the streets. Snow turned to water in the gutters, running in thin streams that caught the light. Children followed those small rivers, tracing their paths with sticks, watching them twist and disappear into drains. The air was damp and cool, carrying the mixed scent of earth and melting ice. From open windows came the faint sounds of sweeping and the creak of chairs dragged closer to the sunlight. By midday, the sky had cleared completely. The clouds that had hung for weeks were gone, leaving a blue so pale it seemed new. On the bridges, people stopped to look down at the water below, darker now, wider, alive with motion. The current had grown strong enough to bend the reflections of the city into long, trembling lines. Each gust of wind scattered the image, reshaping it again and again. It was a quiet kind of conversation between air and water, between light and time. Along the warehouses near the docks, workers opened windows that had been sealed shut since before the storm. Warm air flowed inside, bringing with it the smell of the river. Papers on desks lifted slightly and settled again. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the wide, empty spaces. Outside, gulls circled low, calling softly to one another over the sound of the tide. Their voices blended with the creaking of ropes and the slow rhythm of the water striking wood. In the afternoon, a ferry crossed the river for the first time since the thaw. It moved slowly, its engines humming deep beneath the deck. Passengers stood close to the railings, watching the water part below them. The city behind them shimmered in the sunlight, while ahead, the opposite shore glowed faintly through the mist. The ferry's wake spread wide, then faded back into calm. The journey was short, but it felt endless, not in distance, but in the quiet passage of time itself. In the narrow streets near the waterfront, shops opened their doors. The sound of bells rang out softly as people entered. Buckets of melting snow were poured into the drains, steam rising where the cold met the warmth of the stones. The smell of bread and coffee filled the air. For the first time in weeks, laughter came easily, light and unhurried. The storm's shadow had finally lifted, leaving behind a gentler kind of silence. Toward evening, the river deepened in color. The sunlight turned bronze, and the waves caught fire beneath it. From every vantage point, the bridges, the hills, the piers, people stopped to look. No one spoke loudly. The scene itself was enough. The living river, the breathing city, the long reflection of sky upon water. It felt as if the day were holding still, unwilling to end. When the first lamps were lit, the river caught their light and carried it along its surface. Each glow stretched and trembled, then dissolved into the moving current. It was a soft kind of brilliance, a light that did not conquer darkness but traveled with it, side by side. From the far end of the docks, the city looked like a string of golden beads laid gently along the shore. The water moved below, whispering its steady, patient words, and the night answered with silence. Night came softly, folding over the city like a warm veil. The air had lost its sharpness. It felt smooth now, easy to breathe. Mist rose again from the river and drifted into the streets, glowing faintly under the lamps. Each droplet caught the light for a heartbeat, then vanished into the dark. The water moved slowly, heavy with reflection. The sound of the current echoed through the quiet docks, low and even. Wood creaked, ropes swayed, metal touched metal in faint, ringing notes. It was not noise, it was language. The river spoke in motion and weight, in the patient rhythm of rising and falling, of holding and releasing. Its words were not meant to be understood, but felt, like the pulse beneath one's skin. Across the water, the city shimmered in soft gold. Windows glowed like floating embers, thousands of small fires watching over the night. Smoke drifted from chimneys and joined the mist above the roofs. The stars, pale and still, appeared one by one, and their faint reflections trembled beside the city lights on the water's surface. Everything, the river, the sky, the world itself, seemed to be breathing in the same slow measure. A single boat moved across the current. Its lantern swung gently at the bow, casting a trail of light that broke and reformed with each wave. The sound of the oars dipping into the water echoed softly between the banks. The boatman hummed to himself not a song, but a rhythm that matched the turning of the oars. The tune carried over the water, fading as it traveled, until it became part of the river's own voice. On the shore, people lingered by the piers. They stood without speaking, hands in pockets, eyes on the dark water. Some had come to see if the ice was truly gone. Others simply watched the way the current caught the light. There was peace in it, a quiet assurance that the season had changed and that the city too had turned with it. Farther uptown, where the bridges met the riverbanks, the thaw continued. Water dripped from the iron rails, steady and rhythmic. Each drop struck the stones below with a faint silver sound. The bridges themselves seemed alive, breathing through the mist. When trains passed overhead, the low vibration joined the hum of the river, blending into one deep tone that rolled through the air like distant thunder softened by time. In the houses near the waterfront, windows were left slightly open. The scent of the river drifted in, damp, cold, alive. It carried the faint echo of waves and the quiet rhythm of boats moving in the dark. Inside, lamps flickered, papers rustled. Someone closed a book. The city had learned again how to sleep, not in silence, but in harmony with the slow, endless murmur of the tide. By midnight, the fog thickened. The lamps along the riverbank appeared as small floating spheres of gold. Their reflections stretched far into the moving water, trembling and rejoining with each ripple. It looked as if the earth and sky had traded places, stars below, lights above the world turned upside down by calm. The current moved beneath all of it, steady and patient, whispering its long story to anyone still awake to hear. When the wind came, it carried the scent of open sea. It slipped through the streets, brushing against doors and windows, lifting loose pages, stirring curtains. For a moment, the city seemed to answer, creaking, sighing, alive. Then the air settled again, leaving behind a stillness so deep It could have been mistaken for sleep. Before dawn, the mist began to fade. The first pale light returned to the water, gentle as breath. The river, no longer hidden, revealed its true color again, not black, not gray, but a shifting silver, alive with motion. From the docks came the faint call of a gull, and somewhere far downstream, the echo of another answered. The sound was small but filled the air completely. As the sun rose, the river brightened. Its surface turned to glass, then to gold. Every wave, every movement caught the light. The city behind it glowed softly in the morning haze, its rooftops wet and shining. The day began in silence. But it was not an empty silence, it was full, like a promise kept. And though no one named it, everyone who saw the river that morning understood what it had said. It had spoken not of storms or seasons, but of endurance, of how even stillness holds life beneath it, waiting for the right moment to move again. The river had spoken, and the city had listened. The return of spring. The season changed without anyone noticing at first. There was no sudden warmth, no burst of color, only a quiet easing in the air, the faint scent of damp soil rising beneath the melting snow. The frost that once ruled the windows faded each morning, leaving clear glass and the gentle promise of light. The wind had softened, trading its sharp edge for a slow, patient touch. Along the streets, patches of earth began to show. They appeared like forgotten memories, small dark circles at the base of trees. Water moved again through the gutters, tracing silver lines along the stones. Birdsong returned in single notes, uncertain but persistent, as though testing the silence left behind. Each sound lingered in the still air before blending with the rhythm of footsteps and wheels. In the gardens and parks, the snow receded day by day. Where it had melted, the ground glistened rich, dark, alive. Tiny shoots broke through the soil, fragile yet deliberate. Their color was not yet green, but something close to it, a whisper of what was to come. People paused to look, bending close, surprised by such quiet life after so long a winter. Down by the river, the water flowed freely now. The ice was gone. The current moved without hesitation. Its surface caught every bit of light the sky offered, turning it into soft ripples of silver. Boats crossed from shore to shore, leaving slow, even wakes that closed again behind them. The sound of their passage blended with the hum of the city, as if water and stone had agreed to move together once more. In the markets, crates of fruit arrived from the south. Apples, pears, and early oranges brightened the stalls. Their scent filled the cold air, sharp and sweet at once. People lingered, touching the smooth skins of the fruit, smiling without reason. The colors seemed unreal against the gray of the streets. Small flames of sunlight carried from faraway places. Everywhere, Windows were opened wider. Curtains fluttered in the soft breeze. Rooms that had felt closed and heavy through the long winter began to breathe again. Dust lifted from shelves, drifting through the beams of light that fell across the floors. The city's sound changed, less echo, more warmth. Even silence felt different now, as though filled with distant wings. On the rooftops, workers mended tiles loosened by ice. They moved slowly, their tools glinting in the sun. Below them, carriages rolled through the wet streets, the wheels sending up small sprays of water. Children followed, laughing softly as they stepped in the puddles left behind. The air smelled of wet wood, coal smoke, and something faintly sweet, the first hint of blooming things. By late afternoon, a faint gold spread across the sky. The light touched every window, every line of iron and stone. In that glow, the city seemed almost weightless. Shadows lengthened gently, blending with the reflection of clouds on the water. People lingered outdoors longer than before, their coats unbuttoned, their hands bare to the air. It was not warmth yet, but it was promise. The first conversation between winter and spring. At the harbor, ships prepared for new journeys. Sails were checked, ropes coiled, decks scrubbed clean. The river's tide carried a new scent, the wide, restless breath of the sea. Seagulls followed its movement, drifting above the masts in easy circles. The water spoke again, not in ice or in silence, but in motion, a low, endless murmur of return. When evening came, it carried softness instead of cold. The lamps glowed early, their light golden against the damp stones. Reflections shimmered in every puddle, trembling gently with the footsteps of those passing by. The city looked younger somehow, its corners less sharp, its air less heavy. Somewhere unseen, the first blossoms opened, scenting the darkness with quiet sweetness. The night accepted them, patient and calm. The following days unfolded gently, one after another. No single morning announced the arrival of spring, yet it was there, quiet and undeniable. The air carried a softness that touched the skin like memory. The sky, once pale and distant, now held color again, faint blue at dawn, gold at dusk. Between those hours, the city moved with a calm rhythm, as though following an unseen pulse beneath the ground. In the parks, the snow had disappeared completely. The grass beneath it was flattened and pale, but alive. Each day it rose a little higher, stretching toward the sun. Children played along the paths, their voices blending with the rustle of branches. The trees were still bare, but their shapes had changed, less skeletal now, more full, as if they were remembering their purpose. A few buds had begun to swell along the tips of branches, small and uncertain, but unmistakably new. Near the river, the sound of work returned. Dock hands sang under their breath as they loaded crates, the rhythm of their voices rising and falling with the tide. The water, darker now, carried reflections of sunlight that flickered across the hulls of ships. Every surface seemed to shimmer, even the stones along the shore. The city had become a mirror for the light it once hid. In quiet neighborhoods, people began to plant again. Small gardens appeared behind iron fences where soil had been turned and watered. The first seeds were pressed into the earth. Lettuce, peas, the beginnings of color yet to come. Hands worked slowly, almost tenderly. No one expected quick growth. It was enough simply to touch the soil and know it was alive. On the avenues, shops displayed flowers in their windows. Violets, hyacinths, daffodils, brought from greenhouses outside the city. Their scent drifted into the street, mingling with the cool air. People stopped to look, smiling without speaking. For a moment, each passerby became still, as if those small blooms had reminded them of something lost and quietly returned. At the harbor, ferries crossed the water with ease now. The mist of early morning clung to their sides, glowing pale gold in the rising light. Each whistle echoed across the city, long and low, marking the start of the day. From the decks, passengers watched the skyline glimmer, tall shapes softened by haze, rising from a river that had once been frozen and silent. Now it moved endlessly, carrying the scent of faraway shores. By afternoon, the air grew warmer. Windows opened wide, doors stood ajar. The sounds of the city deepened: hammers, footsteps, the slow clatter of wheels on stone. Yet even the busiest streets seemed calmer than before. The storm's memory lingered, reminding people to move gently, to listen to the spaces between sounds. In a quiet workshop near Washington Square, an old clockmaker sat by his window, polishing brass gears. The sunlight fell across his hands, glinting off the metal. Outside, he could hear the faint murmur of the park voices, footsteps, birds calling softly from the bare trees. He paused for a moment to listen. The steady ticking of the clocks behind him joined with those distant sounds, creating a rhythm that filled the room like a low heartbeat. He smiled, set his tools aside, and let the moment pass without hurry. Toward evening, clouds drifted in from the west. They were light and thin, their edges colored rose and violet. The air cooled again, but did not return to coldness. People lingered on the streets as lamps were lit. The light spread slowly through the city, reflected on the wet cobblestones, blending with the fading sky. For a few minutes, everything shimmered: sky, water, glass, stone, all part of the same quiet glow. Down by the river, the tide rose, gentle and wide. The water lapped against the piers with a sound like breathing. It carried the faint scent of the sea, salt and wind mixed with the warmth of earth. The city, listening, seemed to answer in silence. The day folded into night without resistance, as though one world had slipped seamlessly into another. When darkness came, it was not complete. The stars appeared one by one, faint but steady. Their light mixed with the glow from the city below, until it was impossible to tell where the sky ended and the water began. The river's surface held them all: the lamps, the moon, the stars trembling softly in the current. It was as if spring itself had chosen to arrive in reflection, quiet and endless. The nights grew shorter. Each morning arrived a little earlier, the darkness pulling away with quiet grace. Dew gathered along the edges of windows, forming small, perfect beads that caught the light before vanishing. Birds sang before dawn now, their voices threading through the cool air, weaving sound into silence. The city, waking, no longer shivered. It stretched and breathed as if it, too, had been waiting for this slow renewal. Along the avenues, trees opened their first leaves. They appeared suddenly, almost invisible, at first tiny green sparks against the pale branches. But each day they grew, and soon the color deepened, softening the lines of the streets. The air smelled faintly of pollen and rain. People noticed without speaking, pausing beneath the branches, eyes turned upward to the gentle weight of new life. In the mornings, sunlight reached farther into the narrow streets. Shadows retreated to the corners. Laundry hung from windows, bright against the sky. The sound of footsteps echoed more lightly now, as though the ground itself had softened. Carts rolled more easily, their wheels humming along the damp stones. From bakeries came the scent of warm bread, blending with the sharp sweetness of the air. At the harbor, the ships were ready. Their sails had been repaired, their decks scrubbed clean. The masts stood tall, cutting through the haze. Crews moved slowly but with purpose, voices calm, hands sure. When the first ships drifted from the docks, the water parted with a low sigh, like a whisper of gratitude. The tide carried them out to sea, and the river followed, as it always had, its voice deep and steady. Back in the city, the parks were green again. The ground that had been frozen for months now yielded easily underfoot. Children ran across the grass, leaving faint prints that closed behind them. The sound of their laughter rose with the wind, soft and bright. Old men sat on benches, watching with patient eyes. The trees above them swayed gently, each movement measured, each rustle like the turn of a page. On quiet evenings, the river reflected the sky's colors, pale gold, deep rose, then blue-gray as night descended. The city lights shimmered upon the surface, their glow rippling outward until the reflections blurred. It was no longer the river of winter, locked and still, nor the restless flood of early thaw. It had become something calm and full, holding the memory of both silence and motion. The city lived by its rhythm now, not fearing its power, but trusting its constancy. Inside the homes along the shore, windows were left open at night. Curtains moved with the breeze. The sounds that entered the low murmur of water, the faint call of a bird, the whisper of leaves, all blended into the quiet song of the season. Fires no longer burned. The air itself was warm enough to comfort. People slept easily, their dreams slow and untroubled, like the current beneath the stars. As spring deepened, colors multiplied. Markets filled with flowers and fruit. The streets glowed with life horses, wheels, voices, all moving in a shared rhythm. No one remembered the storm as it had been, only its echo, the way silence had held the city, the way light had returned. The memory had softened, becoming part of the rhythm of work and rest, of morning and evening, of winter passing into warmth. One evening near the river's bend, the sky turned the color of pearl. The wind carried a scent of rain, though none would fall. The surface of the water shivered once, then stilled. The city's lamps flickered on, one by one, and their reflections stretched toward the opposite shore. In that moment, it seemed the whole world had paused, not to listen, not to speak, but to exist in quiet understanding. The storm, the silence, the thaw, the work, the waiting, all of it had led here, to this softness, this light, this calm. The city did not celebrate, it simply lived, breathing with the rhythm of the river, the trees, the sky. Every window glowed, every voice carried gently into the air. And above it all, spring returned, not as an event, but as a continuation, as the promise that life, even after the longest stillness, always finds its way back. The river moved, and the city moved with it. Together they carried the quiet story of a season's end and a beginning reborn. And as night settled one last time, the air was warm, the stars patient, and the world at last completely at peace. As night fell once more, laying a soft veil over the newly revived city, every sound seemed sharper, more meaningful. The wind brushing over rooftops, still warm with lamplight, the gentle lap of water against wooden posts, the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone crossing a street that no longer felt threateningly cold. After days held captive by the storm, the city now breathed steadily again, slow, deep, full of gratitude. Perhaps the most precious thing was not the restored scenery, but the renewed appreciation for the ordinary. Street lamps that once burned, unnoticed, now glowed with tender warmth. Familiar roads revealed their quiet beauty, even in the moments of stillness. And the river, faithful, patient, became a mirror reflecting the delicate hopes stirring within people's hearts. In that liminal space where the remnants of winter met the first hints of spring, everything felt gentler, as if touched by unseen hands. People often find themselves in small things after turmoil, and the city was no exception. It learned to walk again through simple rhythms, the fishermen returning to their boats, the bakery ovens kindling their first morning fires, children laughing in the softened snow. Together they wove a symphony of life, not loud or triumphant, but steady, honest, and deeply human. When the last traces of the storm finally melted away, the city was no longer what it had been. It carried the memory of those who had endured the cold nights, the warmth of hands that worked tirelessly, and the quiet strength born from days of stillness. Its resilience did not shout. It glowed a soft, enduring light born from survival and gratitude. And from above, the city shimmered like a horizontal constellation stars, scattered not across the sky but along streets, rooftops, and the surface of the river. It was a reminder that life always finds a way to heal itself, even if slowly, even if painfully. Like the river flowing with quiet determination, the people and the city continued forward, carrying with them a gentle and unwavering belief that peace No matter how long, the winter will always return.